What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to episode number 3. We made it to number 3, y'all, of the Leader You're Becoming podcast. In this podcast, we talk about how to cultivate a great workplace that people love coming to each and every day. And they don't have to hate coming to work every day, right? We talk about leadership. We talk about stewardship. There is a difference between the two on this podcast. And so I'm so excited. I am Coach T. I'm your host of this podcast. And again, this is a podcast that really is birthed out of just being obedient to God. And so I'll leave it at that. And so I pray today that you get something incredible from this podcast, because we're going to talk about something that I don't actually hear spoken about very often as it relates to not podcasts, just in general, which is the ambiguity that comes along with leadership. I'll say it again, the ambiguity of what comes along with leadership. And so this episode today is entitled, How to Handle the Ambiguity of Leadership. Perfect, right? So with that being said, I want to actually start this off with a story. And it's actually something that when I look back in history, it actually is very, very fascinating to me. And it is two presidents who made decisions with somewhat dicey information with both, and history views those decisions very, very differently. And it's President Obama and George W. Bush. President Obama, back in 2011, if you don't remember, he's the one who authorized the raid that ultimately killed Osama bin Laden, right? And he didn't have a lot of 100% certainty as far as information was concerned. And the story talks about when he made the decision, there was like a party going on, or it was right around the time of a party, and this information came in and he had to step away, made a decision, watched the decision happen, unfold, and ultimately they killed Osama bin Laden. And so I say that because just the calm during that moment of, man, this is the most wanted person on the entire planet, most wanted. And you have to now make a decision to make a strategic attack, raid, to see, if it's them. And then if it is them, what's going to happen from a potential casualty standpoint, right, of U.S. citizens that are out there leading this raid. And then if it works, and if it doesn't work, what are the ramifications going to be of that? And just the calmness and the stillness, if you will, of being able to make that decision with so much ambiguity around it. Now, the reason why that example is important is because we're still on the backdrop at this point in time in 2011 of a decision with not all the information with George Bush. George Bush didn't have full information around the weapons of mass destruction, as we know, right? Didn't have it, but he made a decision to evade Iraq, to go into Iraq, to find weapons of mass destruction. And as it comes out, that probably wasn't the greatest idea, right? Many would say it was not a good idea, right? At the end of the day. And history viewed two people that made decisions, leaders, the leaders of the free world, the highest ranking leadership position many will call in our present modern society, right, of the world. Two people, two leaders, both made decisions with a lot of ambiguity, a lot of uncertainty, and history views both of those decisions entirely differently because of the results. And that's the part I really want to talk about today. As leaders, we don't have a magic ball that goes into the future to say exactly what the result's going to be. We don't. And we are judged on our results as leaders. And that's just the reality of the situation. So then we can't really say, I know the future, so I'm going to make the best decision. We just have to decide what we're going to do and how we get to that decision. And we just have to let the results be what they are at the end of the day. But dealing with that level of pressure and ambiguity is extremely difficult. And so I actually want to talk today about a framework that I've used, and I just kind of put together into a perfect framework, but it was something I've been doing, which is called Decide. It's a simple to easy to use framework that you can reference and go to. It's called Decide when there's a lot of ambiguity and you got to move forward. You still got to move forward as a leader because people depend on us to do so. And so And so today, looking at those leaders making decisions, history's going to do what it does, right? Who knows? 50 years from now, it may reverse to say Obama's was a poor decision and Bush's was a great decision. I don't know what 50 years is going to look like and how we're going to interpret history and who's going to be coordinating the interpretation of history. That's another conversation in the future. But what I do know is that in today, we can do some things very deliberately to work through the emotions of things as leaders and work through and put some things in place so that we can at least position ourselves to being able to have the results that we intended to have. And so with that being said, this is something that's a tough pill to swallow for a lot of people, because if you're like anything like me, I'll I want to make good decisions, right? I don't like wasting time. I really don't. I talk to my family all the time. I don't like wasting time. And at the end of the day, I want to be right. I want to be right about the decisions that I make. And when I say right, meaning it doesn't need to be my idea so I'm right. But I want to make sure that I'm making decisions, because every time I make a decision, that's impacting somebody's family as a leader. If I go out there and I make a decision about an investment and we go and we hire a bunch of people for resources around that investment, and it was not the right time, or it was not the right market fit, or we didn't really have the right skill set, or we didn't have the right marketing or sales, etc., then guess what? All those people that I committed jobs to, I got to go back to them and say, hey, we're going to close this down, or we got to go in a different direction. And their families and their commitments, and they've shaped their lives in some form or fashion around that job. And that's the seriousness and the weight of it. And so if you're like me, you want to make decisions, and you want to make as many of the right decisions. And a right decision is nothing but a decision that gets the result, exceeds the result, or gets the result that you wanted, right? And so, but the reality is, as a leader, you're not going to make the right decision all the time. You're really not. The results are not going to prove to be the results that you wanted. George Bush wanted the result to be they found weapons of mass destruction. So he can say, I told you, we haven't found weapons of mass destruction. And it's 20 years later, right? At the end of the day. And so it is what it is, right? But if you're a leader and you care about that, it does create a lot of pressure. That does create an environment where it can be stressful. It does create an environment where you can freeze, because it might be easier, and this is real talk here, it might be easier to not do nothing. The risk of not doing anything could actually be less than doing something and it not work out. And a lot of leaders I've seen, myself included at times, it was just easier not to do anything. But that's not the best long-term solution, especially if you see a problem right now. A lot of times we'll put our head in the sand and we're like, oh, you know what? This thing will go away, or it'll work itself out, or, it just needs to cook a little bit longer. But in your heart of hearts that sometimes that might be true, but you also know in your heart of hearts that, it's time to actually do something about this, and I got to make a decision. And so just working through and understanding that the higher up you go in leadership, and I can say this from, pure example, or personal experience, the higher up you go in leadership, the harder it is. You may get more data, but sometimes data actually causes more confusion, right? Because now you got to sort through to figure out, well, which data is the appropriate data to make a decision. And so it actually gets harder sometimes the more data you have and the higher up you go, because you have more lives on the line, there's higher risk, there's more ambiguity through the context of the environment, and that is extremely hard. And I just want to encourage you today with an easy framework to use that you can put into place, that allows you to get you closer to the result that you want, and you can keep going back to it over and over and over again. And so, without further ado, that framework is called, again, decide. It's called decide, right? The word decide. And it simply means, the D stands for define the real problem. I'm going to go through it really quick. D stands for define the real problem. E stands for examine the data available. Examine the data available. The C stands for consider the context. This is critical, which we'll get to in a second. I stands for intentionally decide. Don't just decide. There's a difference when you intentionally decide. The D stands for determine the pivot points. And this is a big challenge. This was a huge challenge for me. And E stands for evaluate and respond. All right. So again, the D to start this off on decide. This is a framework you can use in the midst of ambiguity, especially when there's no right answer. And sometimes worse is there's 2 or 3 really good answers. And either one can produce outcome based on the data, based on, other people's recommendation, based on your mentor, whatever. It doesn't really matter. And that's when it's really, really, really difficult to make a decision, right? Some people are like, well, it's really hard when I only have one option. Well, you only got one option, just go with that. It's not hard to make a decision when you only got one option. Just do that. Do that, go from there, right? But when you got 3 or 4 maybe great options, right? You can really see this when you're trying to hire for a position and you have you have an opportunity where you got 5 candidates and all 5 of them you can see yourself in the future with. And you can see a great future. But each one you can see gets you takes you down a different path to the future that you're envisioning for that role. And that becomes really challenging because you get to pick your journey, or as we like to say in the office, you get to pick your hard. In leadership, everything is hard. Everything can be hard, right? At the end of the day, you get to choose which one you want. But at least we get that choice. So with that being said, let's talk through this framework that I believe will be a true blessing to your life. D, the first D stands for define the real problem. I once heard it said a accurately defined problem is 70 to 80% of the problem solved, right? Or something of that nature. I'm paraphrasing, so I apologize if I messed that up. But if you got to really define what the real problem is, this allows you to really understand, like, what are we really solving for? Right? Because nothing worse than solving for the wrong problem. You go through this whole process, you think it's A, and you're solving and you're doing all these things, you're coming up with, with ideas, and then you get an idea, you decide on an idea, then you move forward, and then you start producing a result, and you're like, this ain't the result, and then you come back, and you're like, that's not the problem. That wasn't the problem at all. That's even worse. That wasn't even the problem, right? It's somewhere else over there. It was Z was the real problem. A might have been a symptom of the problem, but Z was the actual real root problem. And this is one where you actually have to take your time, right? In EOS, going through EOS, we talk about, and during the IDS process, identify the problem. It's really getting down, you really digging deep down into what is the root, what is really the issue here, right? And oftentimes, what you think it is, the stated issue, isn't actually what it is. It's a symptom that's annoying, that's on the surface that everybody can see. But when you really get down to it, you find that the real problem sometimes is very nuanced, right? And it takes a very critical eye and understanding and clarity to really understand what that root problem is. But this is the first one. You in the place of ambiguity, you got to really understand, okay, what problem am I solving? Because it's already uncertain. It's already not clear, this whole situation, right? So I need to figure out, if I solve the right problem, I get to the right problem, we can move forward. Now, we'll say this. In the spirit of you got to move forward and make a decision, don't spend all your time there. You spend a good chunk of time there, but you gotta, you're going to get here, you're going to have to move forward, and action does create clarity. So I'll say that as an overarching, action creates clarity, okay? So yes, you're going to spend some time, you're going to really dig down deep to understand like what the real problem is, who might be the problem, doesn't really matter, how do we get here, understanding, but once we got where we are, take some action, but keep in mind, you're asking yourself along this whole process, is this the problem? Is this the problem? And if you are able to do that, it makes life a lot easier, okay? So D first, define the real problem. Next, examine, right? Examine the data available. This is now where you're like, okay, what data do I have? right? Like what sources of information? Is the information coming from people? Is that a data point? Is the information coming from, some KPIs? Is the information coming from understanding our client? Is it market research? What information, what data do I have available to me? And sometimes this data isn't always just the surface level stuff. Sometimes you got to dig down deep to really understand different trends of data, something that may not look relevant, but may be adjacent. And that gives some more context of data to the situation, right? So you got to pull in all the information, because as a leader, you got to be able to determine what's going on. And this is where, in the case of the president had generals advising. He had the CIA advising. You have, your chief of staff. You got all these different people around the table, all the different agencies, right, that are working collaboratively sometimes and working independently and coming to you saying, here goes what we got. CIA, FBI says this, the DEA says this, and the military over here says this, and the Navy says this, and bubble, and everybody's coming. And then now, as the president, has to look at all of this, see what data is the same, see where the different perspectives are from the different pieces of data, and then be able to say, okay, I got enough information, or I have some information. Now I can start to move to the next phase, which is I gotta consider the context. Now this right here is critical. You have to understand the context in which you're making your decision, right? In where you're deciding, because you got to understand the people involved. You got to understand the timing and the urgency of the situation, right? Everything can't be urgent, because if everything's urgent, nothing's urgent, right? And we talk about that a lot. As a leader, you can't make everything seem like it's urgent, because it becomes white noise to people. And then they can't really determine what is and what is not really urgent. So that's just another tip. You have to understand consider the context of everything, of your organization's capacity. You may have a big, huge plan, a big vision, but you don't have the capacity for it. Or maybe you do in your role, but your team isn't, because they're burnt out. They're tired. You might have just brought them through a merger, right? And you might have brought them through another situation. And they may have overcome a big problem. They may have had a big loss in the business. So you got to understand the context of the decisions that you're making. And then lastly, and some would argue most importantly, you got to understand the political and relational dynamics. That right there alone could really put a bottleneck on what you decide to move forward with. That political, and we try to keep politics out of work, and I can tell you it's extremely hard, because there's relational things. There's people, at the end of the day, people operate primarily out of fear. Whether we want that to be true or not, most people operate out of fear. And so understanding that people oftentimes will first operate out of fear, you then have to make a determination on how I approach the situation. Most people are probably going to be defensive, or want to pause or take a step back, simply because they don't want to lose something. And it might be losing their job. It might be losing, prestige in the company. It might be losing their position. It might be losing, their friendships, their clique. It doesn't matter. They potentially can lose. So as a leader, as you're going through this, you got to understand the context. And I think about in Obama's, situation, President Obama, we already, went into another country trying to find something. And now he's trying to find something else. Now, it might have been somebody everybody wanted to find, obviously. But if it went wrong, the context of him being the first African-American president, come on, that's context, right? Him, putting military in harm's way when they couldn't find this dude for 20 years before that, right? Or 10 years, or 8 years before that. They couldn't find him. Well, he'd been wanted before all of that, right? Nobody's been able to find him. And so now you're putting your political career on the line to do something that's putting other people's lives in harm's way, that's a context of making that decision. He could have easily been like, not enough information. And half the room probably would have been like, you know what, you're right. You're right. Not enough information. And so just something to consider and to think about. You have to understand the context. And then I intentionally decide. What this means is at some point, as my good friend who taught me this back in the day, poop or get off the pot. Right? Maybe, as a kid, your parents told you that. Poop or get off the pot. Get off the toilet. You got to poop or figure it out. What you going to do here? Right? You're going to have to make a decision intentionally. Meaning you own your decision. Period. You own it. You own your decision 100%. No questions asked. And as a leader, that's where that intentional part comes in. If you are not intentionally owning your decision, and you're just kind of like, oh, this is what we decided, okay, and no, you stand behind it. If you said it, we're going to do it. And that's huge, right? If you don't own it fully, your people will not respect you later for it. They won't respect you later for it. All right? Then D, determine the pivot points. So this is something that I have to really continue to always be aware of, which is like own it, being intentional, make a decision. Okay, that's fine. I own that. That's fine. That's an easy one. But taking a moment to say, okay, if we're starting this process, this new thing that we decided to do, at what point do we take a moment now and say, is it working? Yes or no? Right? And you determine your pivot point on the front end so that you don't get caught in the emotion of it later on the back end. And that's why you would want to do this. And then I forget what the term is called in the military, but it's kind of like, I think it's called their backstop, right? Like if you're like, all right, I'm on this road and I'm following the map and I'm navigating here. If I see this tree or this building, that means we went too far west or we went too far east or too far north, whatever that might be. And we need to backtrack, right? So you got to be able to have those points where you're saying, all right, this is a crossroad, and that crossroad might be time. That crossroad might be results of product, that client engagement, reviews, whatever that might be. But there's a moment that's going to come up in time where you got to say, this is working. Let's do more of the thing that's giving us the most out of this. Or, you know what? This isn't working. We need to stop and pivot, or we need to stop, blow it up, and start all over again. Maybe this ain't the right problem we're solving, right? Let's start this whole decide process over again. Or we can just maneuver, because guess what? We just got new information. And if we got new information, then we have the right to make an adjustment. Now, that doesn't mean you have to every time. You just have the right to. Now, I will say this. It's getting a little dark, so I am going to turn on some lights. And this is our podcast, so we can do how we want to do it. So hopefully that works out, because funny enough, I started blending into the seat. Hey, listen, I'll keep it real. This is the leader you're becoming. So if you're not going to, well, I promise authenticity. That's what was in my head. You're probably thinking it too as you're watching. So I'm just going to call it out, and we can have a good laugh about it. You can pause, put on pause, laugh, and we're going to get back to it. All right. So after you intentionally decide, where we at? Are we going to determine our pivot points, right? That's funny. That actually did make me laugh. Determine our pivot points. You have to make a decision to say, okay, at this point, we can move forward. We can keep going forward, or this is the time we can adjust, right? And don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. So many leaders get caught in this, like, I made this decision, I have to see it through. No, I mean, yes, but changing directions doesn't mean you're not seeing it through. If I'm driving, let's say I want to go to California, and I'm in the Philadelphia area. That's where I'm at today. You see all the snow, right? And I'm like, I want to go to California. And I just start driving. And I start seeing signs for Florida. I'm not going the right direction. I'm not going the right direction, y'all. I mean, like, no, I'm not going the right direction. I was trying to figure out how I could say that you can no, there's no way. I am not going the right direction. I was supposed to be going west. I went south. Now, all the data could have pointed, the data could have been, there's sunshine this way, right? Warmer weather, beautiful beaches. And I'm like, all right, that's all I got. All right, I'm going this way. This seems right. And then you start seeing signs that say Florida, yeah, it got warmer weather, beautiful beaches. That matches California, right? Like, but It's not California. It's Florida. Change directions. Go back and go west, okay? And so that's just one of those things where it's okay. You got permission. If nobody ever gave you permission, you got permission. If new data comes in, you can change your direction. Now, again, there's ambiguity around that too. Because some things you got to just keep going. Come on now. Some things you got to keep going. And other things you do have to make a decision on, do I make an adjustment? And I know that's hard. That's hard. Because we're sitting here trying to figure out how to have perfect decisions. And I'm here to tell you, there is no perfect decisions. Right? You had two of the highest ranking leaders on the planet in modern history both make decisions, and history views those decisions differently because predominantly of the results. But both of them had a positive result in mind when they made those decisions, right? And I'm not here for the political conversation around George Bush and whether he believed that or not. Like, that's not this conversation, right? As far as I'm concerned, in this moment, he made a decision because he believed that there was weapons of mass destruction, period. And that's why he sent the troops over, and that's what we're working off of, all right? Because I know I got some people going to be, oh, no, it was something else. He was getting them back for his daddy, right? Okay, maybe, right? But, okay, that's neither here nor there. At the end of the day, what we know, part of what we know is that's why he went over, and it didn't get the result. And he's judged very harshly for it. Obama had a good result was, hey, we're going to find Osama bin Laden. And guess what? They found him, identified him, and now he's celebrated for being decisive and making that decision. And so I say that to say, again, you have to have your pivot points of being able to say, I'm going to pivot at this moment in time, and you might be wrong. You might pivot, and you should have stayed going forward. Just own it. You owned it already. What do we talk about up front, right? Just own it, apologize, and move forward. Simple as that. Right? And that takes us right into the next one. Evaluate, right? E, evaluate and respond. Did it work? Right? If it worked, keep pushing it forward. If it didn't work, okay, whatever. Like, like not whatever, but like kind of whatever. Like at the end of the day, like most of our jobs does not have somebody's life on the line. At the end of, like, in a critical, like, immediate way. If you're in the military and you listen to this, that's different. There is literally people's life on the line. If you are doing some ridiculously hazardous job, yes, life is on the line, right? So I want to be very sensitive to that. Police officers, firemen, like, life is on the line. It is critical. But some of us, right, are selling used cars. Some of us are selling golf equipment. Like, somebody coming in and your team that sells golf equipment, there's not a lot of risk out there for, you selling golf equipment if you make a bad decision on should we, dress the mannequin this way or change the direction of our marketing or anything of that nature, right? Now, we do have risks, again, of people's livelihood being on the line. So I don't take that lightly, and I want to be sensitive to that also. And we can also say that it's not someone's immediate health risk, right? But as you do this and you understand it, make a decision. Once you make that decision, you evaluate it. If it didn't work, as I said earlier, you just move on, right? And that's the big E. Evaluate and respond accordingly. You're either going to respond by doing more of the things that work, or you're going to respond by changing directions because you have new information. And if sometimes the new information just might be the learned experience through what you just went through. And that is the decide. Again, from the top, the D stands for define the real problem. The E stands for examine the data that's available to you. That's important. That is available to you. C, consider the context. So critical. E, evaluate. Whoop, did I spell that wrong? I think I did. Sorry. C, consider the context. I, intentionally decide. D, determine the pivot points. And E, evaluate and respond accordingly. And now this is, we talk about this in the context of the garden. And I mentioned this on the last two episodes of the podcast. I truly believe that our workplace is a garden. right? Like we talk from the Garden of Eden. This is just something God really put on my heart. And each person is a beautiful plant, or maybe a seed bearing plant, a fruit bearing plant, what have you, right? In this garden. And it's our job as leaders to cultivate this garden. And one thing I want to leave with you is, as a leader who's deciding, right, in the midst of ambiguity, you cannot force results. I'll say it again. You cannot force results. All you can do is create and cultivate the conditions of a garden. And if the conditions are right, growth is a natural byproduct. Growth is a natural byproduct of the right conditions. And a good leader understands the seasons, context, and will create the conditions necessary for the season. A leader understands that you can do all you want. Be like, seed, grow, do more. But if that's not the right conditions, it's not going to grow. And if it does grow, it's going to grow and it's going to be plucked right up because it's going to be a weed. And how many times do we have that where we're creating conditions in our garden, right? And all we're creating is weeds. It looks beautiful. It looks like that. But as soon as a good wind comes through, soon as a good rainstorm comes through, soon as a good, storm comes through, it's out, it's gone. And so that is also something that you have to consider as a leader, that yes, we need some short term, right? Because we got to pay bills today. The bills are here due today, right? People need to get paid today. We want to do some nice things and great things for our people today, and for our clients, most importantly, today. And we also got to be thinking about, a good cultivator is also thinking about producing today and understanding that some things just take time. They just need some time, right? Like, they just need time to grow. But I, today, can cultivate the condition, right, in which that thing that needs time is continuing to grow. And that's what I call developing other leaders. Developing some positions just take time. And in people, in any position, they're going to get better. We want them to get better with time, but we got to make sure the conditions are right. And some roles do require immediacy, right? And some roles require immediacy and long term. But I believe every position requires long term. Just what is in the moment do we need to pull out of it? And so I want to encourage you today. Just remember, you are a leader cultivating that garden, but there's a lot of ambiguity. The seasons are changing. You're in March and it looks like it's supposed to be springtime, but it's snowing. Or you might be in July and expecting it to be hot and it's cold. Or you might be in October thinking it's going to get cold and it is 90 plus degrees and you're in California. You're like, what is going on here, right? Or you're in Florida and it's 15 degrees and you're losing your mind, right? What conditions, the context are happening, and then how do you condition and create your environment around it? And this framework, with all that ambiguity and uncertainty that comes naturally with our position, and sometimes it's forced upon us in external things, how you decide to move forward is going to be critical to that. So I don't even hope, I know this was a blessing to somebody today, right? If nobody else, it was me. But I know, and all jokes aside, I know that this is a real conversation that leaders sometimes don't want to talk about, because leaders sometimes just want to act like they got it all together, or act like they know it all, or act like they got to have all the answers. And we don't. We really don't know. And one of the most powerful things, and I'm feeling led to say this, so as we wrap this up, one of the most powerful things you can do as a leader is actually say, I don't know. I don't know. Period. I don't know. Now, let me decide. What's the problem? So I don't know something, and that might be the problem. But what you asked me, let's understand that problem, right? Let's go get the data around it, right? Let's understand the context of the question or what you're asking and the environment we're asking it in. Let's intentionally decide, right? Let's determine, if we decide to do something, where we're going to, our checkpoints, where are going to be our crossroads, and then how we're going to respond to it and evaluate it, keep doing more, or change it up and we go through the process again if necessary. So I want to encourage you with that today. God bless you. On this YouTube channel, subscribe, right? If it's a blessing to you and you feel like you're getting something out of it, subscribe, share with other people. As Myron Golden always says, I trust you to be smart enough to make a decision whether this is the right place for you to be and to listen and to gain some wisdom from. All right, God bless you. I'm Coach T from the Leader You're Becoming podcast. Love y'all. God bless.